Please welcome to the stage the one, the only, your favorite author, Brandon Sanderson. Is this on? Good. Hello. Welcome. Dragonsteel 2022. There are a lot of you here. So, I get to give you the keynote today, which is my prerogative as the author. Here's what we're going to do for the next 2 hours. So, first off, I am going to give you a little speech. If you've been to one of my book signings before, you know that you give the stage and the microphone to Professor Sanderson, and he rambles for a little bit. This won't be too long. It's only like 10 or 15 minutes. I actually threw the whole thing I've been planning away earlier today and rewrote it to something new. So you get to hear what I'm interested in right now. It will relate to the books, kind of, I'm sure. After that, we'll be doing some announcements. Now, I don't want you to expect me to announce a big movie or television thing today. It's not going to happen. I apologize. You will be getting some announcements along that vein eventually, but not today, okay? It's coming, I promise, but these things take time to do right. So, but I will have some other kind of fun and cool announcements for you. After that, we're going to do a Q&A. You theoretically scan the QR code, wrote in your questions. Your names will appear, and you can come up to the microphone, which should be somewhere around here, and then you can ask the question, and I will theoretically answer. And then after that, we're going to be doing a reading from Stormlight 5. Now, that reading will be from the Zeth flashbacks, so it's not a spoiler too much if you haven't read the series, because it takes place years before the first book starts. So, I like to do those readings in these large groups. If you're more interested in the spoiler reading, well, that happened yesterday. A lot of you were there. I do think we recorded it, so that might go up eventually on my YouTube channel, all right? So let me get my notes out here. I apologize if I have to consult these a little more than normal, but that's what happens when you rewrite your speech last minute. All right, so. Oh, well, thank you, random citizen. You rock as well. So, there's a story told about the famous book 1984, right? I heard this story when I was in college, and the story goes like this, that George Orwell, when he was writing it, wanted to call it 1948, and that his editor wouldn't let him, so he changed the letters around and made it 1984. I looked this up. There's no actual corroboration of this, but what I did find when I was researching this was really interesting. I actually like this story better because that story I heard in college makes it almost like he didn't see it as a science fiction story. And he did. He actually, the initial title for it was The Last Man in Europe. And he'd always imagined it as this far future science fiction book. And in fact, when he was changing the title, he first picked 1980, then 1982, and eventually settled on 1984. Who knows why he did that? But I do remember when 1984 happened, and people were talking about, well, this doesn't feel very much like the book, which is a kind of running theme. In science fiction, 2019 was a big year. I don't know if you guys know this, but 2019 is both the year of Blade Runner and of Akira. And so, I don't think that Tokyo has been exploded anytime recently, and I don't think many of you are replicants. So you might run into this kind of argument sometimes that is made that, science fiction doesn't actually tend to be that good about predicting the future. We've gotten some things right. Almost all of them were Arthur C. Clarke, but I'll say we have gotten things right, meaning Arthur C. Clarke got things right. But that's kind of the wrong way to look at it, because science fiction isn't about the past or about the future. I've said this before. And fantasy, as a corollary, I don't think is about the past. I think both of them are about the now, and this interesting idea that both of them are in ways about the author. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. What do my books say about me? It's kind of this weird thing if you think about it, right? Like, here is a lot of you who all are basically reading my deepest, most intimate and dark and interesting and sometimes not so interesting thoughts on the page. And it's this weird form of telepathy where what I'm thinking can go into your brain and what I'm interested in ends up on the page. I often think that we have, in some ways, the wrong way of looking at stories. I talk to people and I think about how I was before I became a writer, and we imagine that stories are like this perfect, magical thing that gets pulled down from the heavens or maybe from the spiritual realm if you're into the Cosmere, and then manifest as this perfect thing. I don't think that's really the case. In fact, I kind of don't like the phrase. Sometimes when you see a movie review, they'll be like, it's not a perfect movie, but, or you'll get a review, it's not a perfect book, but. Part of the reason I don't like this is it's like, what is a perfect book? What makes a perfect movie? I don't think that can even really exist. What is the book? It's a picture of who the author is in a lot of ways. Recently, a couple years ago, we released a book called The Way of Kings Prime, which is the version of The Way of Kings I wrote in 2002. And it shares some interesting DNA with the version that many of you have read that was published in 2010. It's really fun to be able to release that because you can see how at two different points in my life, taking the same basic ideas and writing a book about them produced very different books. But it's like with the same characters, it's an alternate dimension version of The Way of Kings. And I, more and more, as I've become a writer, have viewed my books like this, kind of a snapshot of who I am at that very moment. So I'm finishing the Wax and Wane series. It is now complete. Many of you now have it. This took 12 years. I was thinking about that the other day. I'm like, did it really take me 12 years to write this series? It feels like only recently I started it, and yet 12 years is quite a long time. In fact, if you look at the length of time The Wheel of Time was getting published, that's about how long it took Robert Jordan to get from the first book up until Knife of Dreams, which is just kind of just mind-boggling when you consider it. Number one, he wrote a lot of words. You guys think I'm prolific. I don't know. He got like 400,000 word books out every year for a while. But also, it kind of makes me look at the Wax and Wane series, kind of look at it in retrospect and say, what does this series say about me? What does it mean? And that actually makes me panic just a little bit every time I think about that, because meaning, as it comes to my own books, is sometimes really hard for me to define. Let me tell you a story. You guys will like this. So flashback to little baby Brandon in high school. Baby Brandon in high school, when I was the same age that my son Joel is now. Yep, he's 15. When I was 15, I had just gotten into fantasy books. I've been reading them for about a year. And I was in a class, an English class, and they assigned us to write a certain sort of thing. It was an allegory. We were studying Jonathan Swift, right? We'd read A Modest Proposal, and the teacher's like, write us an allegory. And this was the first time I can remember ever sitting down to write a story. And I sat down, and I wrote this cool story about dwarves in a flying city, right? Because I'm me. And the dwarves were like mining at in the city, because it was more like a big flying asteroid with buildings on top. And they're like, they needed this special metal that was inside of it, that if they mined it all out, the asteroid would crash. But they needed it for self-defense against the elves that were attacking them. Because it was the 80s. This is what you wrote about. I really love this story. It maybe went a little longer than the assignment required. The assignment was for around 2 pages, and mine was 28. Yeah. Even as a little baby Brandon, I did have some of the same tendencies. So I turned in the story, super excited because it turned out so well. My first story. And I got it back a week later, and it was a D-. Yes. Because, and the teacher said, this was actually really fun to read, but it did not fulfill the assignment. What is the allegory? And I wrote back, I went to the teacher, I said, environmentalism something? And the teacher said, no, I need you to actually fulfill the assignment and write an allegory. So I wrote like some goofy story about jugglers with each of the balls had a word written on them, and then they dropped some of the balls, and I got an A. It was like a page long. It was really bad, but it fulfilled the assignment. And, meaning because of this, like in the back of my head, like allegory and I don't necessarily get along, right? That I have a healthy respect for it. But this was actually, you guys probably already know this, I've talked about before, this was a point of contention between C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. So Lewis kind of liked his allegories. I don't know if you've read his stories, but he kind of liked his allegories. And Tolkien has famously written, I abhor an allegory. And I really connect with when he writes about that, because I really, really like when my books are meaningful, but I don't want to ascribe them a meaning. And that distinction is really important to me. So approaching my own book and being like, what does the lost metal mean? I'm not sure if I even want to go down that path, but I do think it'll be fun to talk a little bit about what the Mistborn series in general has meant to me, and why each of these books that I wrote in this new era, why I wrote them. I can remember the first time I pitched the Mistborn series to anyone, and it was to my wife, Emily. We were at Outback Steakhouse. Was it Em? We were at Outback Steakhouse, and I said, listen to this thing that I want to do. Because I was just finishing Mistborn 1. And so I said, I want to write a trilogy of trilogies. And I want to jump forward in time and things like this. And yet, at the same time, I was kind of scared of this. And let me explain why. One of the things that I'd started by then doing was building the Cosmere. But I was timid about the Cosmere. If you guys have read the early books, like the Cosmere references are really, really slight. They're just barely in there. And this is because conventional wisdom at the time was that people did not like continuity on the large scale. The conventional wisdom was that people liked their stories to be a little more episodic, and that publishers were scared of continuity. In fact, when I had sent The Way of Kings Prime to Tor, they had been very, very, very scared about this book. And they wrote back and they're like, can we split it into like 5? It's too big. And there was this kind of fear at that point. Now, this was the era where you have to understand, epic fantasy was going through a hard transitional phase, right? Yes, Robert Jordan and George R. Martin had been huge in the 90s, but no one had been able to replicate that for many years. In fact, there were a lot of high-profile flops where people tried to launch giant series, and the only things that had been successful lately had been shorter, more serialized fantasy stories. So I had this kind of deep fear inside my head that only right now have I recognized that part of the reason why it was there is that I was afraid, even still, of not fulfilling the assignment, right? Right? If you think about this, like when I was growing up, there was this expectation of what a fantasy novel was. In fact, I remember reading an interview with David Eddings, where he said, oh yeah, here's how you write a fantasy novel. There's a magical rock/sword/ring. Somebody grabs it and everyone else chases them around the continent until it gets destroyed or it gets used, right? And that is one model for writing a fantasy novel, but I've always rebelled against that, right? I've always felt that fantasy as a genre should be the single most imaginative genre out there. It's the genre where you can do anything. And we shouldn't be locked into one type of story or another. But there's always been this thing in the back of my head that's like, am I fulfilling the assignment, right? When I write these weird things, when I say, oh yeah, we're going to jump forward hundreds of years. When I got to the end of Mistborn, my publisher, Tom Doherty, is like, Brandon, this ending's a really bad idea. And he tried really hard to talk me out of Hero of Ages ending. Not giving any spoilers, but he tried to talk me out of it. He's like, bad idea. You know, these are finally selling well. Hero of Ages was the first one that hit the bestseller list. He's like, what are you doing? Give me 30 more of these just like this. Don't do what you're doing. And I said, how about one where they have guns? And he said, nobody wants guns in their fantasy, Brandon. You're not fulfilling the assignment. And I did it anyway, but yeah. But that maybe informs, there's another random citizen. I love you, random citizen. That maybe informs a little bit of where Alloy of Law came from. Alloy of Law, what was going on in my life when I wrote Alloy of Law? I had just finished the second of the 3 Wheel of Time books I was writing, and I needed a break. But I didn't have very much time before I could get back to the next one. I didn't have time to write Words of Radiance, which is what the next big thing I was planning. I needed something fast and fun and kind of lighthearted to distract me from the fact that I then was going to have to write A Memory of Light, which is an awesome book. But man, there's some stuff in Memory of Light that kicks you in the head. And so Alloy of Law grew out of that. It grew out of this sort of, what does it mean to me? This is the book I needed at that moment. I tried to write a short story. It did not work. And then I'm like, all right, full-on novel. But it'll just be a standalone. Yeah. But it was the story that I needed. It was a story that, for me, I often say, like, I was looking at A Memory of Light and being like, I need something different. If that is going to be a 12-course meal, I need the best hamburger around today because tomorrow I've got to go do this thing. But then I finished The Wheel of Time, and I wanted to go back to these characters. I had fallen in love with them. And where did Shadows of Self and Bands of Morning come from? Because these two books are kind of at war with one another a little bit, if you've read them. They are responses to one another in the weirdest way, because if you remember, I don't know if any of you went to the Shadows of Self book launch, but during that one I explained I wrote half of Shadows of Self and then had to stop and work on something else. And when I got back to it, it was really hard to get into it, so I actually jumped forward and wrote Bands of Morning and then came back and finished the second half of Shadows of Self after I'd written Bands of Morning, which is like the weirdest way to write a book series, right? I do not recommend it, but they have an interesting push and pull, pun intended, between one another. Shadows of Self is the series saying to me, Brandon, you wrote this to be fun in Alloy of Law, but you also need to make sure the characters have depth. We need meaning to this series. It can't just be candy. where's the meaning? And Shadows of Self was me finding some of that meaning in kind of some dark places, right? Really pushing the characters to the limits in some ways. And then Bands of Mourning is in some ways a response to that, where I'm like, don't forget to have fun. Can you do both at once? Let's push the characters hard, but let's not forget to have fun. And these two are in a dialogue with one another, in I think some interesting ways. 6 years pass, and it's time now to write the final book. And now we kind of get to, what does the lost metal mean? Like, where was I as a person writing this book? What does it mean to me? I sat down to write this book, and I have to be honest with you, like, when I started Alloy of Law, I didn't know where this would go. I did by the time I was writing Shadows of Self, and Bands of Mourning is like one of my favorite books I've ever written. And it's almost like the series was saying to me, Brandon, you need to not only take us seriously, you need to treat us not like a side project. Right? And in the back of my head, there was this voice saying, yeah, of course that's what you got to do. None of your stories are side projects. All of your stories are your children. People ask me, like particularly young people, I don't know what it is about kids wanting to know what the favorite is, but they always will ask, what's your favorite book? And I have real trouble with that. Robert Jordan would always say, whichever one I'm writing now, which is a really great Robert Jordan-esque answer. He was an Aes Sedai at heart. And he would say that for characters too. They're like, who's your favorite character? He'd be like, whoever I'm writing right now. But he's expressing something that's really, deep inside of us authors, that all of our books have to be our children. And all this time along, I have been sort of overwhelmed by the response to the Cosmere. Not that I should be surprised, but I often say to people, I got kind of lucky in that what I really wanted to do was something everyone was saying you couldn't do, but I started writing it in the era where we proved that people wanted it. Let me explain. I think the reason back in the 80s and 90s people were a little scared of continuity is because catching yourself back up on something that was big was really, really difficult. We didn't have the internet, at least not in its modern form. It was really hard to connect with other people who were into nerdy stuff who could, refresh you on what happened in book 6 or whatever, and things like this. And we were all just a little frightened of it because how do you stay up on it? But if there's one thing that modern storytelling has told us, it's this. The advent of the internet makes it really a lot easier to catch up on these things. And once it does, we love continuity. And I wrote Elantris in 2005, and 2 years after Elantris, something maybe a little bit important happened. It was the release of Iron Man, had pop culture, relevance to pop culture. As I started to write the Mistborn trilogy, the thing that people started to latch onto is they came to me and said, all right, who is this Hoid person? And what is this thing? And what does this mean? And I noticed there's these pools on both of the planets. What is this? And I started to realize that the thing I'd been afraid of, that the publisher had told me, stay away from this, was the very thing that made my stories distinctive, right? And in a lot of ways, it goes all the way back to when I was 15-year-old writing that story, where, what do I really want to be known for? Is it the bland 1.5-page thing that fulfills the assignment? Is that what I really want to be? And so when I sat down to write Lost Metal, the story I was outlining and was working on was one that maybe didn't fulfill the assignment very well. And by that, what I really wanted to do was delve more into the Cosmere, something that I've been a little bit reluctant to do. And so I guess kind of the warning I'm going to give you is that for years I've said this is going to be in the background, right? Lost Metal changes that. Now, I want to be careful because one of the legitimate fears of too much crossover is making you feel left out if you aren't aware of everything, right? I don't want you to go into a book and feel like you're not part of the conversation. But at the same time, this is the thing that makes me and my work distinctive. And I've kind of decided that I'm no longer going to worry if I'm fulfilling the assignment or not. And so this is fair warning to you, all right? When you give books to your friends, give them era 1, where this is in the background, because from now on, the gloves are off. And we're not doing what other people expect us to do. So I present to you the Lost Medal. I hope that you love and enjoy it. And I'm going to give you this warning. There's a lot more crossover than there's been in any book I've ever done before. All right, time for announcements. The first thing I want to do, though, before announcements is I want to give some acknowledgments to the members of my team, right? There was a time when I was able to point to every person in the company and have you applaud for them. My company is now 54 people. I have an HR director. Isn't that weird? Now, of course, it's us. So my HR director is Matt Hatch, who was, when Wheel of Time fandom and things like that. So, we hire the right kind of HR director. But yeah, why is my company 54 people? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The main reason is it takes a lot of people to properly run a convention. Yeah. To ship out 600,000 books, which is what we're going to do next year. To run customer service and all of these things. But what I would like to do is I would like to ask, many of them are out running around and doing things, but I'm going to ask people to stand up by department. All right? And then we'll applaud for them each by department. And so we are going to ask first for the fulfillment, events, and store team to stand up and wave. These are the ones that are probably all working, but this is headed by Kara. So they put on this wonderful convention. I will admit, this is the only thing we've done that was them and not me, right? Meaning I didn't come up with the idea. They came to me and said, hey, Brandon, what if we had a con? And I'm like, I don't know. A con is a lot of work. And they're like, well, if you don't start it, someone's going to. So you might as well do it yourself. And I'd always liked doing these big book launches. And so there where we are. They were right. And this has been wonderful these last 2 years. Next is my editorial department, which is headed by Peter Ahlstrom. Let's give them some applause. Publicity and marketing, headed by Adam, who's probably back there right now. Creative development, which is headed by Isaac. You might say, what the heck is creative development? A lot of what they end up doing is concept art. So in order to do things like the Kickstarter for the minis, we needed to have a lot of concept art on what our canon versions of the various characters were, so that we could have things, be in line with that. And in the past, we'd always just been like, oh, hire some artists, do your best, right? We are no longer in a state where we have to do that. We can actually hire the artists ourselves, and we can have these things. And so Isaac's been doing a ton of work with Ben McSweeney and and all the artists, just making the entire Cosmere have a sort of baseline for its art. So that's what creative development is. We also have operations. My wife, Emily, oversees that, though Matt Hatch is the VP of that. So we'll have them both take a bow. And then our newest department of one person is our narrative department, headed by Dan. Emily, did I forget anyone? And my family. Yay! Oliver, my youngest son, wanted to get up here and do the worm, and I told him, no, we're not doing the worm. You might, that violates our insurance policy. So yeah, the first of our big announcements is Dan Wells. If you haven't heard, Dan, my college friend from the last 25 years and writing buddy, has come on to head our narrative department. This was just because I needed an extra brain, right? I needed an extra brain for narrative, someone that I could have help me do some things in the Cosmere. He is going to be writing some Cosmere novels eventually. Yes. My goal has never been to stop writing. You don't need to worry that I'm going to turn into a James Patterson. That's never been my goal. James Patterson does good work. He is, by all accounts, wonderful to work with. But he works more as an editor. I still want to write the books, but it sure is going to be nice to have another collaborator helping me. And so that's Dan. The first thing we're doing is we're taking my old outline for Dark One, which we made into a graphic novel, but we kind of just handed that off, and they did that on their own. We're going to do a book version of it, Dan and I together, and that's our first project. It won't be in the Cosmere. It is our first kind of collaboration thing together. We will eventually announce, probably at one of these Dragonsteel conventions, what our collaboration will be in the Cosmere. So, all right, here we go. Here's our announcements. You ready for these? First one is Kickstarter for the Words of Radiance Leatherbound. That will be March of 2023, all right? And we plan to do that like we did the other one, with lots of cool swag and things like that. So the next is the next book release. We have a date for the final book of the Skyward series, Defiant. That is November 21st, 2023, which also indicates to you when Dragonsteel 2023 will be. November 20th and 21st, 2023 is our next convention. So, one other question I've been asking, getting a lot of questions about, are the secret projects. So, if you didn't participate in the Kickstarter, how can you get the secret projects? Well, we're going to tell you today. So, Tor and Galance, my US and my UK publisher, have both signed on to publish these. One of the tricks is we want to make sure that people who bought the book via Kickstarter get theirs before they can buy them in bookstores. It's kind of a bad look when people do a Kickstarter and then start selling the thing before people who backed it can get it. We're a little scared of supply chain. So we're giving ourselves a buffer on this. So the print books of these will be available on the first week of April, the last week of June, the first week of October, and the first week of January 2024. So they're going to lag behind by a few months, just so we can make sure we've gotten all of ours shipped. Our goal is still to try to get each of those books out the first month, but we don't have power over when, for instance, the binding material is available and things like that. So we're just giving ourselves a little extra leeway on those. But if you did back the Kickstarter, you will be able to get the ebooks and the audiobooks on the first of each quarter. And if you didn't, the ebooks and audiobooks will be available the 10th of that same month. So there's going to be a delay on the print editions, not on the ebook audio. And I get to announce that Michael and Kate have signed on to do the first 3 of the secret projects. So if you're a fan of Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, Michael will be doing the first one, and then Michael and Kate will be doing the second one, and then Michael and Kate will be doing the third one, alternating certain viewpoints and things like that. So they are hard at work on those as we speak, recording the first one, and you should be able to get that, like I said, on the 1st at midnight. And there will be other ways that you can get a hold of those as well. So, all right, let's see. I did want to give you a warning. If you have been trying to remain completely spoiler-free for these Kickstarter projects, the titles are going to go live on Amazon for pre-order. We tried to work around this. And it turned out that it just was too hard working with the New York and the London publishers to get their listings and things like that. So I'm going to give you a warning. If you go on Amazon and start looking for Brandon Sanderson books in the next year, those titles might pop up. Internally and even on my podcast and things like that, I will still just use the book numbers. Project 1, Project 2, Project 3, and things like that. Until the book itself is out, then I will switch to using it, okay? The actual title. So, fair warning, I think they're up for, Peter, you can tell me, was it today these went up for pre-order? Tomorrow. They go up for pre-order tomorrow. So starting tomorrow, you can pre-order these if you didn't get them. You can get the ebooks and audiobooks coming out. You know, the first one will be January 10th. Or the print book, the 1st of April. So, let's see. Ooh, that's my hotel key. Yeah. Woohoo. All right. Let's see. Okay. The last announcement that I have is how much money we raised for charity this weekend. So, counting the Lightweaver ornaments, the RPG charity event, the Magic Draft, where people have made me sit on the floor and play only with my pinkies, charity auctions of the paintings, it was $32,000. Yeah, that's incredible. By way of comparison, the previous charity thing like this I did was years ago, where Pat Rothfuss and I sat at a computer and I wrote a story about Pat Rothfuss's magical beard. If anyone remembers that, we raised $1,000 that time. You did 32 times better. So, I hear that the RPG event went very well. I got sent images of it as I was working on my speech. So now is the part where we're going to start doing Q&A. So your names will theoretically start appearing on the various boards. Oh, there it is. If your name's listed, come up here to the microphone. You do not have to get in the order that they're listed here. You can just come up, and we will have you ask the questions. And then... Dallin, you want to ask a question? Oh, no. He can be very embarrassing. All right, come up and ask your question first. All right, this is my middle son. Okay.
Stuff.
Okay, no, say it again so they can all hear.
Stuff.
Oh, I thought you said sup. He made me promise that I would call him up to do something. All right, what's your question? Go ahead. Oh, wait, let me preface this. Sorry. This is a non-spoiler Q&A. All right. So we did the spoiler Q&A before. We will have lots of people here who were dragged along by their significant others or by their parents or by their children who haven't read the books and might be planning to. There's always a ton of people like that. So please try not to spoil any books. You can ask things about the beginnings of books, but not about the endings of books, and try to keep them kind of general interest if you can.
Hi, Brandon. So my question was, usually when I tell people to start reading your books, especially with Cosmere, I tell them to start with Elantris, but I just want to know your opinion, especially with the Cosmere, that all that's growing, the best area
the
for
best
people
place
to start.
That's a good question. By the way, you're in costumes. Do you want one of these fancy? They told me these ones are very hard to find. These little coins. So this is a wonderful question. I know that a lot of people love Elantris, and I do too. I think it's a fine book, but I do think it is significantly weaker than Mistborn. So I usually point people to either Mistborn or Warbreaker. Those are now 20 years old, but I grew a lot between, because Elantris was my 6th book, and Mistborn was my 14th book. And so if it's a person I'm talking to, I kind of do find out. I say, all right, what do you like? Do you want to jump into the deep end first? If you do, here's Way of Kings. You just got to trust me, right? It's worth it. But Emperor's Soul is also a great place to start for somebody who maybe doesn't want a book like that. So,
B-Money.
Hey.
Carter Mitchell, Stoneward. Personal opinion, you should start with Talena Elin in the 2nd set of 5. Personal opinion.
Okay.
Personal opinion.
Okay.
My question stands. I don't know where I heard it. I heard once you told the story, or you have an ending in mind, and that you're going to tell to someone who was in the door out. But my question is, do you have an end goal that's going to be everything's going to converge to something, or is there going to be a direction that everything in the Cosmere is moving towards?
Excellent question. So the answer is yes. My goal is, after I finish Stormlight 5, to kind of sit down, now that I have a whole team, right, and be like, all right, here is the outline for the rest of the Cosmere so that you have it. And work on that for a while. I always say I'm going to do this, and I haven't done it yet, but I'm really planning after Stormlight 5 now to do this. Now that I've got a full editorial team and a full creative development team and one narrative guy, that we'll sit down and we will talk over this and things like that. I do have an end goal in mind. I like to start with an ending. This is how I do things. So. Hey, how's it going, Wax?
Howdy. So, I believe you originally said that Era 2 is like Alloy of Law, then a trilogy. Do you still view it that way, or has it changed over the time?
Yeah, so excellent question, by the way. Here's a coin for you. I can't propel them. I'm not an Allomancer. So, excellent question. So what happened is I wrote Alloy of Law. I kind of wanted to write a standalone. I'm not very good at that. Because I finished it and I'm like, ooh, I know where I would go. I know what I want to do. And then I outlined a trilogy and wrote a trilogy. As I was working on this 4th book, I found a lot of places that I wanted to relate to Alloy of Law for whatever reason. Maybe it's that sort of cyclical nature of storytelling. Where you began is often a version of where you end and things like that. I don't view them as much as one book in a trilogy anymore because I deeply interwove a bunch of Alloy of Law references. You'll see when you read the book that kind of Alloy of Law, the soul of Alloy of Law, is very important to this book. And so it's almost a bookend where the two in the middle are kind of in dialogue with each other, and the 1st and the 4th one are kind of in a dialogue with each other.
Hello, I'm Emily.
Hi.
I just won one of the lovely paintings.
Ooh,
I'm very excited.
ooh, you've got one. I just signed those just a bit ago.
My question is really fun-oriented.
Uh-huh.
So if Steris, Rock, and Lift had to prepare potatoes,
Ooh.
how would they prepare them?
How would they prepare the potatoes? All right. This is actually pretty easy because Lift would get there without her potatoes, right? Now, she probably ate some of them. She probably just lost the others. She maybe gave some of them away to people who needed them. She's not going to arrive with any potatoes. Just, if you give Lift a sack of potatoes, it's on you, right? You can know the potatoes went to good places. She probably tried to feed one to her chicken. It probably didn't like it very much. Mine doesn't, but she tried, right? Rock is going to make something delicious because it's a challenge to him. This is he's not familiar with a potato. He's like, what do I do with this thing? He's going to figure out how to make something very, very, very cool with it. Steris is going to buy a recipe book. She's going to make every potato dish in there in case you don't like the one that she made. Right? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I have a question that is kind of a little maybe strange, but I am allergic to nickel, and I realize that's not one of the allomantic things, but are there allomancers who are allergic to their metals?
There are.
And how does that work?
It is not very fun for them. It is legitimately a thing. This is kind of like when I was designing this. Now, to an extent, heavy metals are bad for all of us. And fortunately for allomancers, they burn them away, and they kind of have a change in their physiology that this doesn't hurt them, but it doesn't cover being allergic, and this is just a miserable experience. So hope that you don't roll those cosmic dice when you are reincarnated onto Scadrial.
Hi, Brandon.
Hey.
My name's John. I know this is a little bit of a difficult question, but kind of on like a sliding scale. Overall, how many books do you think your entire series will be?
What a wonderful question. So my original outline for the Cosmere was somewhere between 32 and 38 books. Emily has that. I gave it to her in 2000. See, Joel was not born yet. So this was in 2006 that I gave her the outline, 2007, somewhere around there, for the original Cosmere. Now, that we're going to dig that out and put it up for people to see. We'll probably display it. We want to have a little museum once we build. I think Dragonsteel Village has been announced. Once we have that going, yeah, we'll have a little display because we have some cool things to show. One is the outline for the Cosmere that I did way back then. One is pages from White Sand, right, that I hand wrote in a sketchbook, the first book I ever wrote that I ever finished. Another is Dan Wells, wherever he is. Don't mug him, but he has a Launtress book #1. I number books as I sign them, and it says #1. It's the first book I ever signed, and it says written in it the first book I ever signed. We'll have some of those things up, assuming Dan's willing to loan us his book for inter-museum loan. So this outline had some weird things. I had in my head that the series Dragonsteel was going to be 7 books, right? I've reduced that to 3 books because I took a big chunk of Dragonsteel and put it into Stormlight when I did the Stormlight revision in 2010, right? But I added an extra 4 books in the Wax and Wayne series that were not on that outline. Mistborn was 9 books in that outline, right? Stormlight was 10 books. And it has some other, things in there. One of the things that people keep pointing out to me is they're like, Brandon, Mistborn being 16 books would make a lot of sense. And right now, there are planned to be 13 books. And so if I do the kind of cyberpunk series in between the 1980s and the science fiction series, and I do it as a trilogy, but there's only so many books I can write, guys. But anyway, that's kind of still my goal, is we got the 10 Stormlight, 3 Elantris, 2 Nalthus. Then we've got the White Sand. Do I do White Sand? Do I not? It was on there. We have the graphic novel, so we have that. And then there's like weird things like the Threnody novel I want to write, and 3 of the secret projects are in the Cosmere. That adds 3 that weren't planned, so who knows? But the core of the Cosmere, we talked about the end game before. The core of the Cosmere I have viewed for a long time as being 9 books of Mistborn that are now expanded, 10 books of Stormlight, and 3 books of Elantris. That is the core Cosmere narrative, all right?
Thank you.
Hi, Brandon. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thanks.
So I've really loved the Skyward series, and now that we know that's wrapping up, I want to know, is there more standalone science fiction on the way?
Is there more standalone science fiction on the way? All right. So the answer is there will almost certainly, in fact, there better be because we've signed for them, be the more books in the Skyward universe that I'm writing with Jancy.
Awesome.
Yes. And that is for the foreseeable future, my projects in the kind of that YA/new adult space that I've been playing with the Reckoners and Skyward. That's the plan for there. That is the only plan for non-Cosmere books other than Dark One that we're doing right now, right? So anything else that I would plan would be tied to the Cosmere, but you never can tell. Right? Like I was not planning one of the secret projects. I wasn't planning any of the secret projects, but one of them is 2. 2 is a standalone science fiction-y sort of thing. And so you never can tell what will pop out. I have no current plans other than what are announced, but it's me. So who knows?
Thanks.
Uh-huh.
Kind of a fun question here. If you were to attend a dinner party with your characters and had 3 to 5 of them, who would you?
Oh, attend a dinner party. I'm going to get my water over here. With my characters and have 3 to 5 of them. Who would I pick? Oh, my goodness. Who is least likely to get into trouble and cause disaster, right? Lift? No, not Lift. No, not Lift. No, not Lift. You're naming all sorts of people that danger follows like a cloak. You know? All right. All right, let's put Harmony there because if something does go wrong, having a god around is handy, right? Okay. Let's see, 5. All right. Let's stop yelling. Let me just go. Let's see. Okay, we're going to do Harmony, and then we are going to do Steris because she'll be well prepared for everything. And then we will go with Dalinar because I want him to maybe be able to meet Harmony, which would be kind of fun to see how that goes down. And then, let's see, Yasna, because I'd like her to meet Harmony. That would be really interesting. And then I would pick one of the accountants from the Lost Metal because they're unlikely to cause anyone to come hunting them to destroy the room.
Thank you.
So, they say a lot of writing is autobiographical. Are there any of your characters that are very close to being you, but in a fantasy world?
So I have never put me into a book, not in the same way that like Clive Cussler does and Stephen King does, and I've never put anyone that's particularly close to me. I often say that the characters that I empathize with is a mix between Sazed and Yasna. But I don't know, every character I would say has about an equal amount of me and an equal amount of not me. Every character is a blend of something that I want to explore that is not like myself and something that is very like me. Yeah. I actually have a slightly different answer also. Stephen Leeds is very close to me and that sort of middle manager of a whole bunch of voices in my head. And my son is pointing out, and my mother would like me to note this, that Alcatraz uses my voice in humor. And so she says she reads Alcatraz and is like, oh, I hear you. I think I should be afraid of that. So.
Not to age you at all, but as my wife and I were growing up, middle school, high school, we were reading The First Era Mistborn.
Okay, yep.
And she just really appreciated and adored The First Era because of Vin and because of that character that she was, this very powerful female that she didn't see a lot of other places. So I guess the wider question is, you as a single person, as an author, how do you bring all these different types of people together in a way that so many people feel that they can relate to?
That is an excellent question. I would say that I consider this the most important skill for an author to learn, and it took a long time. This is the thing, like, if you go back to my early books, if you go read, like, the original White Sand Pram that I wrote when I was 19, you'll see that I can put together a plot a little bit. You can see I can put together a scene just fine. My prose isn't terrible. It's not great, but it's not terrible either. But building that connection to characters, making the characters feel real rather than just like cardboard cutouts like we have of B-Money running around here, right? That took 10 years of practice. And it involves, I would say the most important skill is listening. But it's not just listening, it's listening, trying, and iterating, right? You listen, you try writing it out, you give it to somebody and say, did I capture this? And then listen to what they say you did wrong, and then iterate, right? Like, that's the really, like, the gut punch of being a writer. It's thinking you got it right and hearing you got it wrong. And that is just really hard to hear. And it takes time to build that up. It takes time to be able to be, like, aware enough of your writing to understand that even if it's flawed, it still has value to you, and that's okay. You don't have to, you don't have to be panicked about your baby being flawed, and being willing to iterate.
Thank you.
Oh, we have a costume here. Let me throw you a coin while I'm thinking of it, so I don't forget. They gave me these special black coins with iron eyes on them. So, ooh, yeah. So apparently those are a little bit hard to get a hold of. So
I've got two questions. The first one is Zellion, is that name taken from the unpublished novel, I think the sixth incarnation of Pandora?
Yes, that name is taken from that book. And so Zellion's appearance in the Cosmere is related to not that book, but it's kind of the same character reincarnated now into the Cosmere, if that makes sense.
Interesting. And question about speed bubbles, if it's not too spoiler.
That's not too spoiler. As long as you don't, as long as you leave out plot points, you're fine.
Okay. So if you had like a flow of objects on a conveyor belt or a river that went through a speed bubble, would the objects or river consistently get deflected in the same direction, or would it seem random?
It would seem random to you. There is a way you might be able to figure out, because it's going to obey chaos theory sort of things.
Okay.
But it'll be random to the extent that you're able to tell, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi. I'm trying to understand the relationship between hemallurgy and the Shard Ruin.
Okay.
Most of the invested arts involve inputs of energy from of the Shard investiture that corresponds to it. That doesn't seem to be the case for ferrochemy and hemallurgy.
Right.
So I'm wondering what the relationship is between the corresponding shards and those two metallic arts.
So there's a whole lot going on here, and I'm not sure how much I can get into right here, but one of the basic concepts I built for the Cosmere way back when was that a lot of the different magics would be showing up in different systems, if that makes sense, and that there are certain underpinning fundamental rules. And this is why you'll see light weaving working the same way across 3 different magic systems. I think you've seen it in 3 different ones so far. Else Calling is going to work the same way, and things like this. Hemallurgy is a thing that is like a part of the nature of the Cosmere that the Shard simply knew and was able to tell people how to do. So is it of that Shard? Well, yes, because you would have to be following that Shard's intent in order to use it, but it could be discovered on other planets as well.
and independent of Ruin's presence.
Yes.
Really, except for as Ruin
Except for his rooms, but
whole.
yes, exactly. You are
Awesome.
correct.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So with the gloves off, if you could go back to any of your previously published works and add in a more foreground Cosmere reference, where would you do it and what would it be?
What a wonderful, interesting question. What would I do? Now, I often make the same joke, and I'm going to make now, which is, I have read the books where people go back in time, and you always end up making yourself disappear. So if I had the chance, I wouldn't actually. But in a theoretical, right, what would I do? I think that the appearance of Hoyd in Mistborn 2 is like super arcane. And I was like super afraid of it, and I maybe didn't need to be, right? And I think that's the one where he was doing something relatively interesting in the scope of the entire Cosmere, and so it would be cool to be able to see like more than just like, I don't know if you've read the deleted scenes, but his footprints were in the deleted scenes. But I cut that and revised it and basically cut almost all reference out of that book. I would go back in and get him somewhere in there doing the same things he was doing in the deleted scenes so that you could see him.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Hello. So this is a investiture mechanics question.
Okay.
So if an advanced android was created with artificial intelligence using technology, but not investiture, like other artificial intelligence,
yes,
artificial blood, organs, all that stuff, would they be able to access invested arts, such as invested arts? I don't want to...
No, that's an excellent question. It's a really interesting question in the context of the Cosmere. So for right now, I am saying, now, maybe we will invent true AI, and I'll have to backpedal, but what I'm saying in the Cosmere, true AI requires investiture. And so a thinking machine is going to basically, the lane between a thinking machine and a spren is going to get very blurred, right? And it's going to either attract it or require it. And so the answer to you is yes, to an extent. There are some arts that are easier to use and some that are hard. It depends on, all of these things. But the answer is yes, but there is going to basically be a cognitive and spiritual aspect to that is going to basically be a person. A thinking machine that actually is self-aware would be a person in the Cosmere for that reason, and would have the same cognitive sort of aspect and spiritual aspect, so a soul, if you would, that a physical, an organic being would have.
Oh, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Since you have Dan now on your staff,
yes,
I am wondering if you'll ever be able to get back to arithmetus.
Oh, wow. Okay. So here's the thing about Arithmetus, though. I really feel that if I was going to, and I would like to get a co-author, if I was going to get a co-author of Arithmetus, I really feel like they need to be someone who's really steeped in Mexican culture, because I want to do things with the Aztec. As I'm writing that sequel. And so, it's called, in my head, it's called the Aztlanian, which, if you know anything about Aztec mythology, is the mythological homeland of the Aztec people. And so I would really be looking for someone who is an expert in Aztec mythology, maybe even someone who speaks a little Nahuatl, something like that, which Dan does, but not to the extent that I would want. So we would be looking for a different co-author for that, if I was going to co-author it. Either I do it myself, or I find someone who can lend kind of more authentic voice to help me and maybe write half the viewpoints.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you love video games a lot. Is
do.
there any inspiration from those video games that you would love to see in your works?
Ooh, inspiration from the video games that I would like to see in my books. The things that I get inspired by in the video games, I tend to already borrow and use, right? Like, it's kind of hard to separate out from me. Growing up being a gamer, to take that and say, what if that affected how I do and design magic systems even? Like when I was working on Moonbreaker, the video game that I worked on, the designer kept saying, Brandon, you sure talk like a video game designer. Are you sure you've never designed any video games? And I'm like, well, no, but I did grow up playing a whole lot of them. And so I think they do some really cool things. The things I most get inspired by with video games, I kind of tuck in the back of my head if I would ever do a video game, because there's certain sorts of storytelling you can do in a video game that you can't do in a book. And there's a couple of cool things I would like to try someday. If someone ever gives me $200 million, or I guess it's only like 50 to 100 to make a video game, then I'll do my wacky ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kickstarter. No, listen to me, guys. Here's the thing. I have seen what has happened in the world of Kickstarter video games, right? I'm going to give you a serious answer to this one because the video game Kickstarter world is full of high-profile flops, even by very respected game designers who've done it many times before. And this tells me something. It tells me, Brandon, if you tried it, you would do an even bigger flop. Because I was able to do a Kickstarter on these secret novels because I know the publishing industry inside and out, and my team does as well, and we knew we could fulfill on it in a way that would be satisfying to the people backing it. I can't promise you that on a video game. And in fact, if like the creator of Mega Man and the creator of Symphony of the Night can't really perform in a Kickstarter environment for a video game, I would be worried about doing it. I know some people have been able to do it successfully, but I would be worried about me doing it. And so I would never kickstart a video game unless I already had the whole video game designed and ready, which means I'd need the money up front. That's just kind of, I love what Kickstarter can do, but I'm also afraid of it, right? Because every time you do a Kickstarter, your name is on the line, and your good name, and it's a promise to everybody in a way that even a book series isn't a promise. And so I want to be really careful with using Kickstarters for that very reason. Yeah. It's why you're not going to see me kickstart a film or television show anytime soon. I don't know that industry enough to trust that I would be able to use that money effectively to give what I would be promising.
Okay, so Spren are reflections of how people in the physical world realm see things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a cognitive shadow, would their personality change based on what people in the physical realm see them as?
So they would be, the short answer is not as much as you're worried about. No more than we tend to change based on what people say to us and how we interact with the people around us. The long answer is, over a long period of time, it can happen, right? And it's going to depend on a number of factors, but we're talking a matter of centuries, not years. The same sort of thing you see happening to vessels of shards can happen to cognitive shadows. So the long answer is yes, but it's not an immediate worry, right? It's not like people start thinking of you and it shifts you, because your perception of yourself is enough strong usually that it rebuffs these sorts of things. Being self-aware does that. And a lot of the influence to things, to like Spren and things like that, happen during kind of formative, not quite self-aware times, if that makes sense. So if you were to become a cognitive shadow right now, it wouldn't be a major concern, but in 1,000 years, you may look back and say, wow, I was shaped by public perception in ways that I wasn't expecting. I know there are some of you here who are, again, those spouses or children or significant others or parents of people who drag you here are like, oh my goodness, I have never been to something more nerdy than people asking detailed lore questions about physics that don't exist. But, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Billy.
Hey.
Newer fan, but plan to be a forever fan, so thank you for doing this for us.
Uh-huh.
My question kind of comes down to, how do you write such strong female characters? What do you do to stop yourself from falling into these, bad tropes that so many TV shows get wrong? I'm thinking of Syl, I'm thinking of Yasna, and how they're totally different, but they rely on such an inner courage that is, unique to the female gender as it is in your books.
So there's a couple of tips I can give you here. There is, being able to get into the head of someone that is not like yourself and write them in an authentic way is kind of relating to that thing that I talked about before, kind of in many ways, the hardest and most important skill for a storyteller to learn. And it does tend to, because of the way our society is set up, it tends to be much harder for men to write women than it is for women to write men, generally. And this is just kind of an aspect of our culture. It's not going to be one-to-one. You will find plenty of people you'll find plenty of women who are bad at writing men. You'll find plenty of men who are good at writing women. But it is something that is hard, and indeed, originally, my first books, if we ever release White Sand Prime, you'll see that I was not very good at it when I started out. I have this is one of the things. I often say, and it's kind of a glib way to say it, and there's a lot more nuance to it than the way I say it, but the kind of tweak in my brain that happened was when I stopped writing people to roles and started writing them to, started asking and said, what is their role in the story? And stopped asking that and started asking, who are they? What do they want? Why can't they have it? Why don't they fit into society the way that society says they should? How do they fit into society the way that society says they should? All of those sorts of things, kind of also the whole listening, iterating. I started to get better at this once I started to write, give it to readers and have readers say, this isn't feeling right. And then trying and giving it back and having them say, okay, this felt closer, or no, this felt worse. You did a worse job of this. But it's really that idea. Every person is the hero of their own story, or at least the protagonist of their own story. And every person, nobody is just one role. Everyone is a lot of roles, mixing in really messy ways. And so digging into motivations and digging into passions, rather than saying what is their job in the story, is just super helpful to me. And I don't know if I can give you more than that, because the nuance part of it is, this took me 10 years and I'm still not even sure, right? Like that's the dirty secret of every writer. We're not exactly 100% sure. We know that it works and that over time we've gotten better at it, but what did we do that made it that way? That's what I think I did.
Well, I'm glad it does, so thank you very much.
Hi. So we know that Rasharans are more or less taller than just about anybody else.
Yep.
And this makes it very easy to spot world hoppers. I was wondering, are there any people with dwarfism or some similar condition on Roshar that would make them abnormally short compared to others?
Yes, that does exist. Indeed. Yeah, I'll just say yes.
Thank you.
All right, and I think this is our last question, and then we are going to go to the reading, so.
Well, happy to be the last then. I've got a question about pure tones, if that's not too spoilery.
That's not too spoilery.
Okay.
I'll just talk around anything that could be plot related.
So you did, in your last Q&A, mention you weren't super big on music theory.
Yeah.
So did you know beforehand when you were designing pure tones, one aligning with all the different shards, that in your standard octave you have 12 tones, meaning that 4 shards and another 4 are going to be paired up, or
Yes.
are you kind of departing from
this is part of where I kind of got into trouble with my music theory, as I'm like, what if I had a 16-note scale? And then I talked to all my music theory people, and they're like, well, this and this and this and this and this and this, and I'm like, oh, right? It doesn't actually you can't just make a 16-note scale. It doesn't actually work like that. And so in this case, you are going to have, there are going to be some tweaks, some things that are there. But this is part of when I kind of talked about how it wasn't quite working the way that I'd imagined, but way back when, once I actually talked to people who knew music theory. But I do have how it's going to be going forward. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And I guess, do we have one more? Did they call you up? Yeah, go ahead. They just told me that I told them that around when I needed to cut. So if your name appeared on here, you totally get your question. Is this an Aes Sedai costume? What's that?
A Lappy High one.
Oh.
I have lights in my hair, but it's not easy to remember.
Okay, that's all right. Here, we'll give you a coin.
I'm really inspired by a lot of the world building that you do, and especially some of the amazing planets such as Roshar and Taldane, and especially just how different they are from our own planet. So how do you come up with these sorts of planets, and what do you draw inspiration from to make these amazing other worlds?
That's an excellent question. What a very good question. So when I'm world building, there's a few kind of core principles that I follow. One is this idea that a setting should be like a character, full of quirks and flaws and advantages and all these sorts of things that should kind of almost have a personality for a setting. But at the same time, I'm always looking for something that is going to influence the story in interesting ways. What are the great visuals? What are the great conflicts that this inspires? Conflict is the soul of all storytelling, and so looking for great conflicts. But at the end of the day, it's also just things I've seen, things I've experienced. Like Roshar came from a mix from growing up in Nebraska with these really powerful rainstorms. I remember sitting on my front porch once and the rain was blowing the right direction so it didn't hit me, and just watching this rain blow sideways, right? Like, that's just an amazing experience with lightning crashing every couple of seconds. And then visiting southern Utah and seeing the great slot canyons, things like the Zion Narrows and things like that, and Little Wild Horse, and just how beautiful and awe-inspiring it was to be in this sort of crack in the earth and looking up, and the sky seemed so distant. And those inspired Roshar. So I'm always looking for, like, one of my guiding principles is, I talked about it a little bit earlier, fantasy, I think, should be the most imaginative genre. And when I started to sell, when my books came out, I'd made kind of a sort of a goal to myself that if I was going to be remembered for one thing, I wanted to be remembered as someone who pushed the genre forward into different spaces. And one of the places that I thought I could do that is in some of the world building. We've been kind of locked into the medieval Europe fantasies for a long time. And there's a lot of fantastic stories told there. I'm like, can we push other directions and use a little bit more of the science fiction world building that you see from a lot of the great science fiction stories, but apply it to fantasy, because we can break the laws of physics in ways that they can't. So that is where it came from. Thank you. All right. Ooh. Oh no. Are you guys leaving? I thought you were coming up here. Okay, my family is leaving. Bye-bye, family. They all got up and started walking this way, and I'm like, are they going to embarrass me? Okay. Question. I forgot to ask Adam. Is Adam around, or Octavia? Whoa, hey, Octavia. What did you guys do with the newsletter? Okay, so those were sent out? Okay. Parts 1 and 2. So today we sent out a newsletter that included 2 of the Zeth flashbacks in it. How many of you got that newsletter and have already read those? Okay. All right. So the rest of you have not read those yet, right? I think I'm going to go ahead and start with those, and then try to read one more for those who already read. So I'm going to try and read the first 3 Zeth flashbacks. That means that some of you are going to get a repeat. If I had been super on the ball, we would have sent this out a week ago, and then I would have read like 3 and 4. But I don't want to read 3 and 4 if most of you haven't read 1 and 2. So what's going on here? Well, if you haven't read the Stormlight Archive, in the Stormlight Archive, we do this thing where, again, I do this thing where every book has a flashback sequence. The whole premise is that I started with 5 characters as kind of my core main cast, and each of them had some mysterious events in their past. And in each book, I would do a flashback sequence showing how they ended up at the beginning of book 1. We are now at book 5. The Stormlight Archive is almost finished. Not finished, the first era. There's 5 more books after that. But the arc of the Stormlight Archive, the original arc that I planned, most of the things that I had wanted to do in that original way back when Way of Kings Prime, those lasted books 1 through 5. And we are on the 5th of the characters, who is Zeth. And so today, I thought that I would read for you several of these flashbacks as I'm working on them right now. And let's see. I have to scroll through a whole bunch of other chapters to find them. But what this means is, no, I'm not going to read those to you. They would be super big spoilers. Come on. Yeah, I know some of you want them anyway. But these are really good to read because if you haven't read the Stormlight Archive, then they aren't spoiling anything, or at least not very much, because they start in the past. So I'm going to read probably for the next 40 minutes-ish, 35 minutes. So I hope you're in for the long haul. And I'm just going to start at the first Zeth flashback, and we're going to go until we run out of time, which, you guys are like, you can take as much time as you want. But, all right. Oh, nope, that's not it. That's the wrong chapter. That's a spoiler. Yes, I know. There it is. Zeth's son Naturo found magic upon the wind, and so he danced with it. Strict, methodic movements at first, as per the moves he had memorized. He was as the limbs of the oak, rigid but ready. When they shivered in the wind, Zeth thought he could hear their souls seeking to break free, to shed the bark like shells and emerge with new skin, painted by the cool air, yet aflush with joy all the same. Painful and delightful, like all new things. Zeth scraped bare feet across packed earth as he danced, getting it in on his toes, loving the feel of cultivation's embrace. He moved in a wide circle, getting just close enough to the edge to feel feet on grass before dancing back, spinning to the accompaniment of his sister's flute. It almost seemed alive itself, providing him a partner for his dance, wind made alive through sound. The flute was the voice of the air itself. Time became thick when he danced, molasses minutes and syrup seconds, yet the wind wove among them, visiting each moment to linger before spinning away. He followed it, emulated it, became it. More and more fluid he became, no more rigidity, no more pre-planned steps, sweat flying from his brow to seek the sky. He was the air, churning, spinning, almost violent. Around and around his motions worship for the rock at the center of the patch of ground. For when he was the wind, he felt he could touch that sacred stone, which had never known the hands of men, but which felt the wind each and every day. The stone of his family, the stone of his past, the stone to whom he gave his dance. He came out of the dance finally, panting, drenched in sweat, his sister's music cut off, leaving his only applause the bleating of the sheep. Molly the ewe had wandered into the circular stone dance track again, and, bless her, she was trying to eat the sacred rock. She had never been the smartest of their flock. Zeth stood, breathing deeply, feeling the sweat stream from his face and pool at his chin, wetting the packed earth below with speckles like stars. You practice too hard, his sister, Elid, daughter Naturo, said. Seriously, Zeth, can't you just relax once in a while? He looked to her as she stood up from her seat in the grass and stretched. Elid, at 14, was 3 years older than he was. Like him, she was on the shorter side, though she was squat where he was spindly. Trunk and branch, Doc son Doc called them, which was kind of appropriate, even if both Docs were idiots. She wore orange as her splash, the vivid piece of colorful clothing that marked their station. A bright orange apron, in her case, across the gray dress and vibrant white undergown that poked through to cover forearms and collar. She spun her flute in her fingers, uncaring, like she hadn't broken her previous one doing just that. Zeth bowed his head and walked over to get some water from the barrel. Rainwater had filled it with pure, clean water, not a speck of dirt. He enjoyed looking through that, all the way down to the wooden bottom. He liked seeing things that couldn't be seen, like air and water, things that were there yet not, all at once. Why do you practice so hard? Elid said. There's nobody here but the sheep. Molly likes my dancing, Zeth said softly. Molly is blind, Elid said. She's licking the dirt right now. Molly likes to try new things, he said, smiling and looking toward the old ewe. Whatever, Elid said, flopping back on the grass. Wish there was more to do out here. Dancing is something to do, he said. The flute is something to do. We must learn to add so that... She threw a dirt clod at him. He dodged easily, his feet light on the ground. He might only be 11, but some in the village whispered he was the best dancer among them. He didn't care so much about that. He only cared about doing it right. If he did it wrong, then he still had to practice. Elid didn't think that way. It bothered him how blasé she was about her practicing. She didn't like talking to him about it. She seemed like a different person these days. Zeth shook his head and tied back on his splash, a red handkerchief he wore around his neck, then went on to count the sheep. A few minutes later, when he walked past Elid on his way to count the ones on the other side of her, she was still laying and staring at the sky. Do you believe, she said, the stories they tell about the lands on the other side of the mountains? The lands of the Stonewalkers, he said. Why wouldn't I? 37, 38, where's Swallow? They just sound so outlandish. Elid, listen to the words you say. Of course stories about outlanders sound outlandish. There she is, 39. But really, Zeth, she said, lands where everyone walks on stone? Like, what do? Pick them out in the ground and hop only from stone to stone, avoiding the soil? Zeth glanced at the family stone. It peeked up from the earth like cultivation's own eyeball, staring at the sky, unblinking. 6 feet across, but maybe with half more of it buried, it was a vibrant red-orange. A splash for Roshar, like the one he wore. He'd chosen his color deliberately. I think, he said to her, that there must be a lot more rock out there. I think it's hard to walk without walking on stone. That's why they get desensitized to it. But where do the plants grow then? She asked. Everyone always talks about how the outside is full of dangerous plants that try to eat people. It's all anyone ever whispers about, so there must be soil. True, unless all these plants were like moss, or all those plants were like moss. He had trouble imagining fluffy curls of moss being dangerous, though. Maybe the terrible vines he'd heard about grew from patches of soil, but stretched out long, like tentacles, like the things that lived in the tidal pools a short distance down the coast. I heard, she said, they constantly kill people out there, that nobody adds, they only subtract. Who makes the food then? He said. They must eat each other, she replied. Or maybe they're just always starving. You know how those ones on the coast are. Those ones. He looked nervously into the distance, though you could only see the ocean on the clearest days. His home of Claremont was at the very edge of a broad plain, excellent for grazing, with the ocean beyond, on the southeastern side of Shinovar. An honored location, near one of the monasteries just further along the ridge. In Zeth's estimation, it was the perfect place to live. You could both see the mountains and visit the ocean. You could walk for days across the vibrant green prairie, and there was never lack of grazing land for sheep. He bent down next to old Molly, scratching at the ears as she rubbed her head against him. She might lick rocks and eat dirt, but she was also good for a hug. He loved her warmth, the scratchy wool on his cheek, the way she always stayed nearby to keep him company, even when the others wandered. She bleated softly as he finished hugging her, then wiped the salty, dried sweat from his head. Maybe he shouldn't practice so hard, but he knew he'd forgotten a few steps and gotten them wrong. And he'd stumbled a few times. Their father said that they were blessed in their lives as people who could add beneath the farmer's eyes. Just the right station in life, not required to toil in the field, not forced to kill and subtract, allowed to tend sheep and develop their talents. Free time was the greatest blessing in the world. Maybe that was why the men of the ocean sought to kill them and steal their sheep. If you lived your life out in the lands where everyone walked on stones, your morals must wither, and you sought only to take. It must make them angry to see such a perfect place, full of people with time. The terrible men from the oceans couldn't have that time themselves, so like any petulant child, they simply destroyed it where they saw it. Do you think, Elid whispered, that the servant of the monastery will ever come out and fight for us? Do you think any of them will bring their swords to one of the raids and drive off those terrible men? Elid, he said, standing. The servants of the monasteries would never subtract. I think you're wrong, she replied. Mother says they practice with their weapons in there. Why practice with them except to? They will fight the Voidbringers when they arrive, Zeth snapped. That is the reason, no other. He glanced toward the ocean, unreasonably worried that one of the strange raiders would hear. Don't speak of it. Nobody must know. If the Outlanders realize the treasures of the monasteries. Ha, she said. I'd like to see the awful ones raid the monastery and face down one of the servants. You know that some of them can fly. Don't speak of it, he said. Not in the open. Elid rolled her eyes at him, still lying on the grass. What had she done with her flute? If she lost another and Father had to carve one for her again. She hated when he brought that up as well, so he forced himself to stay quiet. He pulled back from Molly and then looked down at the ground she'd been licking to find another rock. He stumbled back, part shocked, part terrified. This was a small one compared to their other rock, only a handspan wide. It peeked up from the earth, perhaps revealed in last night's regular rain. Zeth put his finger to his lips, backing away. Had he stepped on that while dancing? It was in the packed earth of the dancing ring right around the stone, directly in his path. What should he do? This was the first stone he'd ever seen emerge. Even the ones in other villages and fields, carefully marked off and properly revered, had been there for years. A new stone. Was it a sign? What's up with you? Elid said. Molly step on your toe or something? He couldn't speak, so he simply gestured. She, perhaps sensing his level of concern, rose and walked over. As soon as she saw it, she gasped. They shared a look. I'll go fetch Mother and Father, Zeth said, then started running. Flashback 2. Zeth's father, Naturo, knelt beside the stone. His mother, Zenid, was in the town overseeing painting classes, so they'd sent a messenger to her via Tech, one of their courier parrots. Zeth wasn't certain what frightened him so much about finding a new rock. He danced around the other one daily. He loved their rock, and a new one was cause for celebration, surely? Except he wished it hadn't happened to him finding it. Something new meant possible celebration, possible attention, possible change. He wanted things to remain calm. Quiet days full of languid breezes and gathering sheep. Nights spent beside fireplace or candles, listening to Mother tell stories. He didn't want excitement or some grand new thing. Too much of a chance that it would upset what he already loved. What do we do, Father? Elid said. Do we call the stone shamans? It depends, he said. Depends. Their father was a calm man with a long beard. He liked to keep tied with a green ribbon at the bottom. Head shaded by his customary tall reed hat with a wide brim, he had a good-natured punch that spoke to his skill and talent as a cook. He had all the answers, always. Depends, Zeth said, stepping up beside him, half hiding behind his father's bulky form and peeking out at the little stone. Depends on what? We just do what is right, don't we? Father glanced at their larger stone, then at this one. A single rock is a blessed anomaly. Two might mean more, might mean the Spren have chosen this region. Wait, Elid said, hands on hips. What do you mean? I mean, Father said, there might be others hiding beneath the surface here. Unlikely, but possible. Stone shamans will want to take the entire region, set it off, preserve it, and watch for a few years at least, see if anything else emerges. And us? Zeth asked. Well, we'd have to move, Father replied. Tear down the house just in case it's accidentally on holy ground. Set up somewhere else, wherever the farmer finds lands for us. Maybe in the town. In the town? Zeth turned, looking into the distance, though the nature of the rolling hills prevented him from seeing the town unless he climbed up on top. It was close enough to walk in an hour or so. He liked it that far away. He found the place noisy, congested, smelly. In the town, it felt like the mountains weren't right around the corner because the buildings blocked them out. It felt like the meadows had gone brown, replaced by dull roadways. It felt like the ocean was far off because you couldn't smell the breeze coming off the water any longer. He didn't hate the town, but he got the sense that it hated the things that he loved. I don't want to move, Elid said. We did something great. We found a rock. We shouldn't be punished. If it's right, Zeth said, then we just have to do it, though, right, Father? Father was silent. He stood up, pulling at his trousers, and waited. Soon, Zeth picked out someone hurrying along the path between hills toward their home. Single woman wearing a long green skirt as their splash, an audacious amount of color for their station. White apron over the front, curly light brown hair that bunched up around her head like a cloud. She was carrying a wooden shovel. Zeth gasped, jaw dropping. That couldn't mean. She hurried up to them, shovel over her shoulder. Father nodded toward the new rock, and Mother let out a relieved sigh. So small? You had me worried with that message, Naturo. Mother, Zeth said, what are you doing? Just a quick relocation, she said. We'll dig up the rock, haul it off a few hundred yards, then place it in the soil there. Let it rain a little so it seems to have naturally poked up, then tell everyone about it. Zeth gasped. We can't touch it. Mother pulled out a pair of gloves from her pocket. Of course not. That's why I brought gloves, dear. That's the same thing, Zeth said, horrified. He looked to his father. We can't do this, can we? Father scratched at his beard. Depends, I suppose, on what you think, son. Me? You found the rock, Father said, looking to Mother, who nodded in agreement. So you can decide. I pick what's right, Zeth said immediately. Is it right for us to lose our home? Father asked. Zeth pulled back, glancing at the house. There might be dozens of rocks down. But in the hundreds, one has emerged, so it's unlikely. Moving the stone a few hundred yards will make the shamans watch this region, but without the rocks being so close together, their worry will be mostly nebulous. But then again, we'd have to move it in secret. We're supposed to reverence stone, treat it as the home of the Spren. That's why you dance to it. We hate the stonewalkers on the outside, Zeth said, because of how they treat it. Father knelt down, one hand on Zeth's shoulders. We don't hate them. They're just people who don't know the right way of things. They raid us, Father, Elid said, arms folded. That's not just them being confused. Yes, well, maybe those ones are evil. But it's not because they live in a place with too much stone. It's because of the choices they've made. He looked at Zeth and nodded his head, his beard juggling like it did when he laughed. It's okay, son. You can choose what you want. If you want us to go turn this in now, well... Zeth asked. No, I don't think that I can. Unfair to put you with that. We can move the rock or move our home. I'll accept either one. Maybe we should let him sleep on it, Mother said. No, Zeth said. No, we can move it. All three of them relaxed as he said it, and he felt a sudden shameful resentment. His father said he could choose, but they'd all three clearly wanted a specific decision. He'd made it, he felt, not because it was right, but because they wanted it. But how could all three of them want it if it wasn't right? Maybe Zeth was just broken in some way. He couldn't see what they did. Maybe it was all right to just be lax about all of this. He still hated the entire situation. If they'd just told him what they intended to do and then done it, that would have been fine. But why give him the choice? Didn't that made it his fault, what they were doing? Let me dig about it, Mother said, putting on her gloves. Looks small, but that can be deceiving. Wouldn't want to find out that it's secretly as big as a house down there. They all stepped back, and Mother started digging. Zeth winced every time the shovel scraped the stone. That was not a natural sound. He hoped they would indeed discover the rock was enormous, so the plan had to be abandoned. But in the end, it was really just kind of small, a foot across at the widest. He could have held it in one hand if he'd wanted. No, don't think like that, he told himself, putting his hand down to the side. Molly the ewe, seeming to have sensed his tension, rubbed up against him, and he felt at her wool, her warmth, hoping to draw strength from it. Even Mother seemed a little unsure now that she dug the rock out. She stepped back, leaving it at the hole. She hadn't touched it at all. You scraped it, Elid said. That seems kind of obvious to the sight. Once we've buried it again, Mother said, nobody will see those scrapes. How much trouble would we be in, Elid asked, if someone finds out what we did? I suspect the farmer wouldn't be happy, Father said. He laughed then, and it seemed genuine. Might require some cake to make up for it. Don't look like that, Zeth. We'll show devotion because we choose to. We show devotion because we choose to. And so the kind of devotion is ours to decide. I don't understand, he said. Don't the stone shamans tell us what to do? They tell us the teachings of the Spren, Mother said. She shouldered her shovel. But we choose to interpret those teachings. What we're doing today is reverent, enough for me at least. Zeth thought about that for a moment and wondered, as this was not the first clue in his life, but it might be the most stark one, if this was the reason perhaps they chose to live outside of town. Every other shepherd family lived inside the buildings there, beneath the shadow of the monastery. He'd gone with his family each month for devotion since he could remember. He didn't dare think that his family wasn't faithful, yet the older he got, the more he had questions like these. It was only today, however, that he'd really had to confront the fact. What did he feel about his parents doing something he knew the shamans wouldn't approve of? They were still all standing there, staring at the rock, when the horns sounded. Father looked up, then whispered a soft prayer to the spren of their stone. The horns meant raiders on the coast, coming in from the east in the lands of the stonewalkers. Zeth felt an immediate panic. What do we do? Gather the sheep, Father said, quickly. We must drive them toward Dyson's Valley near town. The farmer has troops in the region. We'll be safe if we move inland. But this, Zeth said, gesturing at the rock, this! Mother, suddenly seeming determined, just reached down and grabbed the rock in two gloved hands. Together, all four of them froze, then looked toward their family stone. It sat there, unblinking, unmoving. None of them were struck down. And Zeth thought he could tell from the way his parents relaxed after a moment that they hadn't been certain what would happen either. At least it seemed they hadn't been secretly moving rocks around all his life. This was a new experience for them. Mother walked over to a nearby tree, then carefully placed the stone in a gnarled nook near the roots. Then she hit it with a handful of leaves. That will do for now, she said. If raiders do come to the home, they'll think nothing of a stone. They don't feel or commune with them. They ignore the spren. Father and Elid went to start gathering the sheep. Zeth just held Molly, who bleated softly while he wished that this day had never begun. And just so that there's something a little bit new, I am going to go ahead and read one more chapter. I just have to scroll through some other chapters full of spoilers before we get to it. Boo. You'll get to read them eventually. Yes, November 2024, assuming I'm on the ball. All right, here we go. Zeth felt that somehow he was in the shadow of the mountains even long after the sun had gone down. The bleating of lambs filled the air, each call jostling one another, emerging from the darkness around him, with a nervous energy reminiscent of a slaughter. Dozens of shepherd families crowded in this ravine, homes left behind as they were too close to the coast, too near to the ravaging Stonewalker raiders and their dark ships. Zeth and his sister had to work hard to keep their flock, driven hastily through the oncoming dusk, from bleeding into the others. It wasn't impossible to sort flocks that intermingled. Indeed, it might be inevitable, considering how shepherds and their families kept pulling further and further back, up against the slope of the mountains, nervously pushing to be as far from those raiders as possible, inching as close as they dared to the place that soil gave way to the stones. These mountains were holy too, but not so much as the ones that emerged from below. The mountains were a fortification against the outside, a wall to hold out the strange people of the other world. They weren't an object of worship so much as a beautiful sign that the spren loved the Shin. Zeth and Elid eventually got their sheep into a huddle, separated enough from the others. The beasts wouldn't sleep easily tonight. They could sense the concern of their masters. Or maybe they sensed more. He looked to the sky and the surrounding clouds covering over moon and star. The night felt oppressive to him. Lanterns made points of light all through the valley below, but they almost seemed to be swimming in that blackness, like they were stars, and he was somehow floating above them. He left his sister to count the sheep and found his mother beside some improvised fire pits, discussing an evening meal to hopefully calm everyone down. Lentil soup, no meat, of course. They weren't soldiers. She put Zeth to work, which is what he realized he'd wanted to do in wandering this direction. Gone and buried was his desire for some simple time to express himself. He needed to sweat, to work out his nervousness, and standing around with the sheep wouldn't have let him accomplish that. So he mashed vegetables with vigor. No chopping. The farmer owned several knives of fine steel, crafted using metals that had been made using mythical powers from the East, so no stone had touched them in their forging, but none were available. So you used your mortar and pestle, crushing the onion, garlic, and carrots together. each of which had been lightly braised to soften them. This went into the large clay basin, and you repeated with some more. Good, thick work. In the distant darkness, music started playing as someone got out their flute. This cut off shortly, leaving the air to the nervous bleeding. The farmer wouldn't want to give away their position in the night in case raiders slipped past his soldiers. Zeth had heard this was the reason for no bonfires and minimal lanterns. Indeed, he worked at his mashing only by the shadowy light of the fire pit, which had been dug into the ground. Zeth enjoyed working on soups like this, even if the onions made his eyes water. The cook, who oversaw the feeding of the people on the lands and made certain nobody went hungry, had created these interesting wooden ladles for measuring. His current one had the bowl of the ladle split into 3 sections with some smaller measuring sections along the handle. All he had to do was fill up the largest of the compartments with carrot, the middle one with onion, and the next one with garlic. Then he filled in the little divots on the handle with salt, ground pepper, and thyme, respectively. He could dump that all into his pestle and begin mashing, and would always have the right proportions. Once that was done, he added it to the basin, with 1 scoop of lentils and 2 of water. With the measuring ladle, he could work without supervision, filling the basin on his own, never worrying about his measurements or being forced to try to tell if the soup tasted right. Despite the late hour, he didn't feel tired. He was too nervous for that, but continued, glad for the work. He enjoyed it specifically because it was almost impossible to do it wrong. Why couldn't more things in life have a tool like this for exact measuring? He hadn't forgotten about the choice his family had made in moving the stone. And unfortunately, now that he had time to think about it, he found himself increasingly uncomfortable. Not just about what they'd done, but that all 3 other members of his family would have agreed to it so quickly without apparent concern. Why was he so different? Fretting over this brought him little satisfaction, though he did finish an entire basin of stew. He left it simmering and moved to another, though the cook herself soon strode past and checked on his work. If she had arrived in person, that said something about the level of the disturbance. The girthy woman was dressed all in color, with a red skirt, blue sash, and yellow blouse. Dark, curly hair up in twin buns on her head, skirt parted at the front to show off another splash of yellow underneath. She was one of those who added, a ruling counterpart to the farmer of the region. Needs more pepper, she declared of the stew he'd left behind. What? No, he'd done it perfectly. Zeth watched with horror as she added some pepper, then bustled off, calling for a group of shepherds to come in and get bowls in a rotation. Why would she say that? She'd created the measuring tool herself. If he followed that, then the soup should taste right. It shouldn't need to be changed in any way, unless he must have done something wrong. Why couldn't he get things right even if he had the tools? He tried to get back to his work after this, but was distracted as another vibrantly dressed figure stepped up to the fire. The farmer was dressed in his robes. He wouldn't work in those, but wore them over his traditional farming clothing, which would be soiled from his day's activity. The dirty clothing was a symbol, but so were the colors he bore, and so it was best for him to both not change and change at the same time. In this case, a violent outer robe and an inner sky blue one of a filmier material. No mere splash of color for the farmer. He was color. The farmer was he who added. He had pale skin like Zeth's family, not exactly uncommon in this region, though those of darker skin were more prevalent. Ah, he said, seeing Zeth. Son Naturo, I had hoped to find your father here at the fire. I'll find him for you, Colors Nimi, Zeth's mother said from the darkness nearby, where she'd been distributing bowls to those who'd come to eat. The farmer bowed his head and spread his hands, indicating he'd accept her offer of service, as one should always try to do. Then he accepted a bowl of food from the cook as she bustled the other direction. Zeth guessed he'd have refused that if others had been unfed, if she hadn't done it herself, but one did not contradict the cook when she delivered food. The farmer settled down then, robes rustling, on a log near Zeth, who continued working on the large basin of stew. The man's presence made Zeth uncomfortable. Was he supposed to say something? Entertain the man? Zeth began sweating despite the cool night air. I have heard from your father about you, son Naturo, the farmer said, that you are becoming an excellent dancer. Perhaps you could dance for my workers and I in the field sometime. I don't know, Colors Nimi, Zeth said, blushing in the night. Entertaining the farmers is usually a job for the musicians, isn't it? It's a job for any who wishes it, the farmer said. Does it add, though? Zeth asked. Dancing doesn't make anything or feed anyone. Ah, you are so young yet, he said. If you think that to sweeten a person's life and make the hours pass is not a form of feeding them. The farmer smiled. The man had a kindly face, oval, like a grain of wheat topped by flaxen hair. His hands were calloused with dirt under the nails, a true sign of nobility. Colors, Nimi? Zeth found himself asking. How do you know what to do? I'm not sure that I follow you, child. How do you know what is right? Zeth said. The right choices to make. How do you decide what they are? The farmer sat for a time, stirring his food, taking a bite now and then. Do you know the difference between men and animals, son Naturo? He asked softly. Zeth frowned, but couldn't find words. It seemed like a question with a great number of possible answers, and he didn't want to say the wrong one. Men, the farmer said, can take actions. Animals take actions, Colors Nimi, Zeth said. It may seem that they do, yes, but if you consider, you will realize they do not. When does the rain act when it falls? Does the rock act when it rolls down the hill? No, the spren move these things. They cannot act, they cannot choose. Zeth thought. Was the farmer testing him? Because his own experience taught him otherwise. Yes, it must be a test. I have a sheep, Zeth said, Molly. She always comes close to me when I'm sad and licks my face. She chooses, Colors Nimi. Does she now? The farmer said, sounding amused. I think not, but I suppose it is wisdom after a fashion to think your own thoughts, son Naturo. Maybe it wasn't a test. Well, regardless, the farmer said, acting, choosing. This is what defines us. And so, you ask what I know what to do? I don't. That is the simple answer. I try, I see, I act. The spren move most things in the world, child, but not us. There's a reason in that, one that the stone shamans teach, and one I ponder as I work. So I must learn what to do? By trying, the farmer said. That's not specific enough, Zeth said, smashing vegetables in his pedestal with vigor. Two people could try and come up with different answers. Surely the spren have the truth for us. Surely if we ask, they will tell us what to do. If they did, the farmer said, would that not simply be the same as moving us? Making of us rain or rocks or other things that do not move on their own? He'd been about to say sheep, Zeth thought. The farmer finished the last of his soup, then glanced up toward the sky, the darkness vaguely broken by the peaks of the mountains. In other lands, rulers don't act, he said. They decide but don't act. That is why I must go each day to bring life from the earth, why I must add rather than subtract. That part made sense, but still, Zeth found that his conversation had yielded fewer answers than he'd hoped. If the farmer didn't know the right thing to do, then what hope did Zeth have? Perhaps, he thought, I can find the spren and ask them. They lived inside of everything, but were coy, emerging only at very special times. Zeth had only seen a spren 3 times in his life that he could remember, and each glimpse had been fleeting over before he could really do more than stare in shock. The farmer stood up as nearby Zeth's father arrived at the dim fireside. Check your mixing tool, son Naturo, farmer said. You've been adding too much pepper to the soup. He walked over and joined Zeth's father, speaking to him softly while washing his bowl at the cleaning trough. Zeth finished his current basin of soup, then got a bowl for himself and one for his sister. He hiked off through the darkness again, up to the armpit of the valley where she was set up and looking pensive, sitting on the grass, her small ceramic lamp in her lap. She looked up as soon as he arrived, walking to him eagerly. Was she that hungry? Zeth, she whispered, we're missing 3 sheep. We'll find them in the morning, he said, handing her a bowl, probably with one of the other flocks. She nodded, and by the flickering light, glanced at him, then at the food, then away, nervous. What? He demanded. Molly is one of the missing sheep, she said. I know how you favor her, Zeth. It's all right, though. I'm sure she's just with one of the other flocks. He frowned. Molly did not like other sheep. She was almost blind, yes, but she could smell them. You're sure, he asked? She's not here? No. Do you remember bringing her? I gathered her to the herd before we struck out, he said, but, there was so much chaos. He met his sister's eyes, then turned to the southwest, toward the ocean and their home. A red haze stained the air in that direction. The Stonewalker raiders, they liked to attack at night. Their metal lanterns were more effective than the ceramic ones the Shin used, and their powerful bows could set the roofs of fishing villages ablaze. The farmer brought in soldiers, he thought, of our own. They'll be defending the coastlands. it was highly unlikely any stonewalkers would strike in as far as Zeph's family homestead. I'll just, he said, go check some of the other nearby flocks. She's easy to spot. He lit himself a lantern and sheltered it with a covering, then went searching. But as he worked, calling to nearby shepherds and asking after missing sheep, a feeling of dread built inside of him. Molly always found her way home. He wasn't certain how she did it, but she was the one he didn't need to worry about when the flock strayed. She always came home. And so, after searching 5 other flocks, Zeph found himself again gazing to the southwest toward that blazing horizon. Perhaps it was his conversation with the farmer, emphasizing that the defining feature of human beings was their ability to choose. Perhaps it was the way his family had done what they had earlier in digging out the rock. Perhaps it was the general air and tone of the day, whispering that there were no right answer, just decisions to be made. But in that moment, Zeph made his decision. A wholly uncharacteristic one he likely wouldn't have made on any other night, even facing the same dire circumstances. He put out his lamp, trusting on the filtered moonlight breaking through the clouds. They went stalking into the night, toward their homestead to find Molly by himself. Well, and there you are. I'm sorry to make you wait 2 years to find out what happens to Zeph. Maybe I'll try to do another reading next year at Dragonsteel to get us a little bit further along. I am currently approaching 80,000 words in the book, which would be a lot of words for a normal book, but these are 450,000 words long. And so I am going to work on it quite assiduously through the next year. I have very little else to distract me, and so my goal is to finish this by January 1st. Not this January 1st, the next one. I'm fast, but I'm not that fast. I want to give a hearty thanks to all of you who came to Dragonsteel 2022. This has been quite the amazing experience. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm going to go meet around 300 of you now that got the lottery to meet me. I'm sorry that I can't meet all of you. There are way too many of you. I sign about 75 books in an hour, and so if I had to do 5,000 of you, you can do the math. But hopefully I'll get to meet all of you at different occasions. Once again, enjoy the Lost Medal, and thank you so very much.
Okay, we have somewhere we're going to